So I've been rewatching the TV show She-Ra, Princess of Power lately, which, by the way, this video isn't about that TV show per se, but if you haven't watched it, you have to. You have to. The character development, the animation, the storyline, the music, it's all just so incredible, and I can't say enough about it. But while I've been watching it, I've been concentrating on the theme of the show around expectations, and especially the expectations that are either consciously or subconsciously put onto you by other people. One of the main characters, Adora, has a lot of expectation put on her because she is the Princess of Power and she yields this godly sense of power, and it's about how she chooses to wield it and the direction with which she chooses to gear that power. And it got me thinking about the same or a similar way. I am in no way an all powerful god or princess of power. I think that would just fuel my ego in a way that would not be very healthy. But I surely do resonate with the themes of expectations in that show. And like I mentioned in one of my past videos too, I'm rereading the Harry Potter series, and I think there's a lot of expectation put on Harry as well by the people who came before him, but also authority figures in general. And it's gotten me really thinking about what expectations can do to a person. Expectations, I think, when they are put on you by yourself, can be good. Same with from other people, but I do feel like there's only a healthy, level of expectation where it gets, I guess, used in the right way. But my point is that the more you live up to or try to live up to the expectations of other people, the further it carries you from your own needs and wants and desires as a person. And oftentimes it can feel as though you don't know what those are, and you don't, sometimes you're so deep within it, you don't realize that the expectation placed upon you has nothing to do with you and actually isn't a part of your journey to authenticity. And I think that's what I'm exploring a lot in my late 20s. I'm also approaching my Saturn return, which I think this kind of checks out because Saturn in my chart is placed in an area where it's asking me to question the value I've been able to place upon myself and that which comes from people around me, and being able to recognize what I am worthy of from my own standing, but also what it does to a person when you rely too heavily on the amount of worth somebody else places on you. And I think it's become a very heavy burden in my life in a very shadowy, unconscious way, to the point where I do feel like on the precipice of my Saturn return, I'm not understanding like what's mine and what just comes from the people around me, most importantly, those who came before me, and also, my parents. And if you know anything about astrology, you'll get what I say when I mention that I have a lot of eighth house placements. And the eighth house is a very shadowy part of our chart. And just like the 12th house, I think there's themes of the subconscious, but more just feelings and emotions that live in you, but you don't really know where they're coming from. And this is in large part due to the fact that the eighth house doesn't make an aspect to the first house. And it's a lot easier for placements in your chart to feel seen and heard when they're making a harmonious aspect to, especially your rising sign or your first house. And I have some pretty polarizing placements in my chart, and part of those polarizing placements are the ones put or placed in my 8th house. And I think that's what I'm kind of uncovering with this journey of expectation versus desire, or my personal wants and needs, because just like the 8th house implies, these are things that are inherited, but it's at a very deep guttural level, to where unless you are able to sit with these things and face your shadow, you're not going to understand like why you react the way you do, or why you go after the things that you do. It's not fun. It's definitely not fun work, because you realize that you were making decisions or having reactions that were coming from a place of mostly trauma. The 8th house deals with a lot of trauma, and one of the themes of the 8th house is inheritance. And yes, that can mean very literal inheritance, money, property. But I like to look at it, especially since the 8th house is a water house. It's ruled by Scorpio, which is a water sign. It can also mean emotional baggage, for sure, and emotional baggage that comes from your ancestral line. And since I have very important placements in my 8th house, I see where this is coming to light in my life, especially currently, as I approach my 30s, and especially go through this Saturn return period. I'm faced with what was passed down to me emotionally, but then also in terms of like how this is connecting to my first house, the house of self. How does it then come across in my first impression, because your first house is like kind of the mask you wear, which I don't fully jive with that meaning of the first house, but it's more like what can people gather from you just by kind of having that first approach, or just first impression. And I've realized that the polarizing energy in my chart is a reflection of not realizing where these guttural, deep ancestral wounds are showing up in the way that I present to the world. I believe this push and pull dynamic has created a lot of friction between, expectations and what I want, what I desire. It's been really tricky to figure out in my life. And I think something that has kind of pushed me into a corner to figure out what this means and how it manifests in my life is developing a chronic illness. I truly think that my dealings with chronic issues, chronic pain, has created this canary in a coal mine situation where my body is now speaking to me in a way that I didn't have access to before. And it's funny, when I look back at my life, there were signs of me having this ability, but in a way that wasn't really quite presenting yet as a chronic illness. But I did have certain health related things, more specifically, like a lot of anxiety when I was growing up. But that anxiety was just my anxiety was my intuition, but I think it gets written off, especially when someone is young, to just feeling anxious or being socially inept. Like, but then when I really looked at myself, I'm like, I'm not actually anxious, but what's happening is my body and my mind are telling me that there's something just off about this situation. But because we're gaslit in society to not even trust our intuition and not trust our own ways of thinking, or we're not even encouraged to just think for ourselves, basically. This has definitely tied to my neurodivergence as well. Like, I didn't know I was neurodivergent for 25 years of my life. And a lot of my confusion surrounding my intuition was linked to not knowing I was neurodivergent either. And this kind of ties to that eighth house inheritance thing. And I do believe that uncovering that shadow aspect of my neurodivergence isn't like this scary, shadowy thing that I'm trying to instill fear about, but it's more about just what I inherited because neurodivergence, for the large part, is genetic. Not understanding why I feared dopamine chasing behaviors for so much of my life. And it's because it's wrapped up in my shadow self, because I'm scared that if I continue to give in to my dopamine related desires, it'll take me to the places that my family members have gotten. And a lot of this shadow is around being impulsive and kind of childlike. This is that Aries energy, getting into situations because you didn't think first and you just acted. That's it, you just acted. But I think that's also what people get wrong about Aries, is that just because we are quick to action doesn't mean we don't have intuition. The Aries intuition is very guttural. Is that a word? It's based in the gut, which is funny because the sign of Virgo is actually linked to the gut, but I'll kind of get to that. But um, part of this balancing of energies in my life between my first house and my eighth house has been, how do I recognize my inner passion, which that passion is tied to that Aries fiery energy, but the passion that comes with a side of emotion because it's eighth house energy. How do I direct that energy instead of just succumbing to all that passion? Because that's two Mars ruled signs in one. Aries in the eighth house. That is a lot of passion. And this is kind of what I'm trying to teach myself lately, is that passion isn't something to be scared of or to ignore or just simply run away from. But again, it's something to be directed. Until I developed these chronic health issues, did I recognize how I should be directing that energy. For so long, I thought I just had to, I don't know if force is the right word, but kind of force myself to follow that passion, but without asking questions. That's what the chronic illness has done for me, is helped me live in my body in a way where I tune into my body and ask myself, does this feel right? I can recognize the passion and really resonate with it and not be scared of it, not want to run from it, but rather recognize it and then say, okay, what do I do with this? How do I work with it in a way that isn't going to be self-destructive? I think that's really what I have been fearing most of my life, and therefore has kind of, on the opposite end of the spectrum here, kept me in a place of, for lack of a better phrase, but like cock blocking myself, but from life, you know? Like recognizing my own passion, but then not knowing how to give in, but in a way that, again, isn't self destructive, doesn't carry me down a path that would be harmful for myself. And I think this is a trap that a lot of neurodivergent people fall into. And I'm not blaming here, it's just from a lack of education about what it means to be neurodivergent, and especially what it means to have an imbalance of dopamine in your body. And I think that's been one of the most freeing things for me, is realizing that I'm not this impulsive, reckless person just because, and I'm also not doomed to be that person because I inherited these traits, because these expectations are being put on me by those who came before me. I'm not subscribed to that. I can transmute that energy, and that's what the 8th house is about, is not feeling helpless because that's the worth that somebody else has given to you, the story that somebody else has told about you. And I swear, until your prefrontal cortex kicks in, you just you give way to that. I think I so easily fell into the trap of believing what other people would tell me about myself my whole life. The freeing part that I was talking about was figuring out that I'm not, doomed to be all of the negative traits of Aries throughout my life. Again, it's about directing that energy and working with it. And that's why figuring out that, because I can also be a very logical person on the other side of this. And I think that's where that polarizing energy comes in, but not in a bad way. But this polarizing energy has helped me fall into my logical Virgo side where I'm able to tap in a way where, I can look at this situation and say, it's not it's not my fault that I have a deficiency of my brain and my chemical makeup and just having a lack of dopamine in my body. That's not my fault. And society at large, and I'm going far beyond, my inheritance from extended family, parents, stuff like that. Society as a whole likes to gaslight us with these things, making us feel like our disabilities are our fault, basically. And that if we just try hard enough, we won't be disabled. Ain't that the most boomer ass shit? Have you ever tried just not being anxious? Have you ever tried turning it off and turning it back on? It frustrates me so much that I lived, and there's people that live a lot longer than I did, not knowing that they're neurodivergent. But 25 years was still like, I want to give myself that moment to be frustrated about my own experience and not, zoom out too much for my experience, because I definitely have a habit of doing that, to where kind of that humanitarian Aquarian energy in my chart also comes through, where it's like, but I can't forget about what everybody else has experienced. And at the same time, that kind of diminishes my own experience. You can see how this is very frustrating to like oscillate between basically standing up for myself and doing what's right for me, but also recognizing what I can do with this inherited energy or inherited sense of worth. And again, that's what I feel like I'm oscillating between at this stage in my life, is how do I remain true to what I've learned about my body and my mind through the uncovering of my chronic health issues and especially my neurodivergence. But then how do I sink into receiving mode as, the outcome of alchemizing this 8th house energy? How do I how do I receive, but at the same time learn to jump into action when I know I need to? And that's really hard to gauge. And I don't know if I have answers for this quite yet. I think this is a very exploratory chat for sure, because I do find myself thriving a lot when I learn to sink into that energy of receiving, but receiving to the point where I'm not then letting other people control the narrative just because they are putting energy into me or giving to me. And this mostly has to do with that topic of self-worth, not letting other people just tell me what I'm worth based on things they give me, advice they give me, or just narratives that they share with me about myself But how silly is that, that I thought for so long that through receiving all these things from outward sources, I then just had to believe it and go with it. And that's where this discernment and personal desire comes in, is now being able to look at who I am when I'm in receiving mode and still recognize where I stand as an individual outside of just what other people are providing to me. I think there's a lot for me to learn on either end of the spectrum here, and this is part of, I think, this Saturn return era is learning to kind of let go of being in charge so much, because oftentimes my dealings with wanting to take charge on things and have authority over my life, or I think a lot of it, especially in relation to neurodivergence, has to do with having autonomy. And that's completely valid, because that's something I still am fighting for myself, especially in the wake of falling into this receiving era. But what's important now, I feel like, especially like I said in relation to the Saturn return, is not seeing people giving to me and or being in receiving mode as something that's restrictive. In my past, it has been something that has been restrictive, because it's created this very cloudy energy around how I can do that for myself and how I can live as an individual outside of receiving. But I also think part of that, is the trauma response of, I don't want anybody to have any sort of autonomy over me. While that is something to still admire, that I want to be in charge of my own life and make my decisions and just be me, because I want to be me. This is about a delicate balance of being in the go getter energy, but also knowing when in life you just need to let people give to you and take care of you. Until I really sat with this shadow part of myself, did I realize how, I don't really want to say toxic, but sometimes toxic, this cycle of needing to be in charge and needing to be the one taking action, like where it's gotten me in life. It's gotten me to a lot of great places, and I'm proud of myself for taking action on my own destiny and striving for autonomy, because that's what PDA is, the persistent drive for autonomy, and that's what a lot of neurodivergent people deal with, and it is it is strong within me. But my shadow, the shadow side of needing to be in charge and the one taking the wheel of the ship, that has a dark side too, and that's where this shadow aspect comes in, is because oftentimes that means you're overcompensating for something. And what I've been overcompensating for is not trusting other people when it comes to providing for me or being a hero for me. Because if we're talking about eighth house energy paired up with Aries energy, Aries, they want to be the hero. They want to be the hero for other people. They want to be the hero of their own story, which I very much admire about myself, that I want to step up to the plate and be the reason that I make a change in my own life. But again, there's a very shadowy element of this where it does come down to trust and allowing other people to do that for you, especially when you're in a very vulnerable state where you can't afford to be your own hero. And I never thought there would be a day where I couldn't be my own hero. That's been the hardest thing to face in all of this chronic health stuff that I've been dealing with for the past year, and quite frankly, longer than that. But in the last year, it just got really bad to the point where, I was struggling to get out of bed some days and even walk some days, cook for myself. My body has deconditioned a lot. And so I'm at this point where feeling really good and I'm wanting to kind of dive back into this whole be my own hero, be entirely autonomous, but there's still something in this journey and I think it's definitely tied to the emotional element for sure, which is where I feel most vulnerable is in my emotions. I mean, that's true of a lot of people, but especially since I'm someone who leans logical, my emotions aren't where I feel most comfortable, but my emotionality surrounds the idea of letting other people protect me and guide me. And so, eighth house energy doesn't have to be just power struggles because that's definitely what it's been up until this point in my life is the power struggle of people seeing my shadow before I do, basically, which is the hell of this inconjunct energy of eighth house and first house is it's an energy other people can recognize, but it's hard for you to see that within yourself. And so, in my experience, I've had people see this within me, but then, this is where the power struggle comes in. They use it to their advantage to manipulate or get me into situations that I didn't fully agree to, but because of the manipulation, and of course, this causes a lot of trust issues as a result. That's what I've been detoxifying from my body, um, like in the last 2 or 3 years, is learning that not everyone that comes in and wants to give to me and kind of sit in that hero energy or just protector energy for me has bad intentions. And that is it's really hard to let in, especially when I've got this fight between I want to do it versus I've seen there's been evidence of me in my life being provided for where I really thrive and I feel really happy when I'm being provided for. But damn, that PDA, persistent drive for autonomy, that really keeps me stuck in this energy of here and there, fight versus letting it happen, I guess. But yeah, I think that's a really big part of my journey and why I've been so drawn to characters like Adora and Harry Potter as of late is because they're showing me that your authentic self can still survive when you've been through trials and tribulations of living up to expectation, but also at the same time trying to figure out your own needs, wants, and desires. And those things can coexist. I mean, the idea is to pull away from too much expectation for sure, because that's when you're able, in my opinion, to recognize your truest desires, is when you just stop thinking about what everybody else has told you that you should want or that you should go after. But also recognizing, some people say that stuff because they really know you and they know your truest desires. So it's like you can again see how much of a struggle this is to figure out. And that's where I'm at with it. And I don't know if I've come to any conclusion about this, but I just feel like talking about it has allowed me to approach this shadowy aspect of myself in a way that doesn't feel as intimidating. And I think that's one thing I'm really thankful for again of this whole chronic illness journey is, and especially working with functional medicine doctors is we're looking at the whole picture. It's not about putting a band-aid on the situation, because then my shadow and the expectations that come along with this shadowy element, they would just persist and continue to make a lot of my chronic health issues worse and worse. As of late in my functional medicine journey, I've gotten to the point where I've talked to my doctors about, I feel so thankful that I've been able to go through certain treatments, try certain supplements, get back into resistance training, all these physical things, which obviously help. I've done a bit of EMDR therapy early in my journey, and that really helped. But I finally think I'm at this kind of plateau in my journey, not in a way where I have no hope that I'll get out of that plateau area, but it's just a space for me to sit and recognize, okay, I've kind of done the most with my physical, and so where do we go from here? The emotional part of things. And again, I've done some of that EMDR work, and that just opened the floodgates for sure. Um, but if you don't remain consistent with unpacking that material, it can still you can still feel very stuck. And while it helped me a lot and open those floodgates, I do think there's a second set of floodgates behind that I'm at a standstill with at the moment. And that's why I think stuff like shadow work is really important at this point, because one way it's been reflected to me is with making videos. Like, I had this idea when I first started that I would pump out a video every week, and I made it 2 weeks in a row, and then by the 3rd week I was like, I don't know if this is for me. I don't know if this is the right path. I don't know if people are going to resonate with this. But then I had to let that all just fall away from me and come to terms with the fact that it doesn't, again, this is about other people and expectations of everything around you but yourself. But that's when I realized, if I like what I'm putting out, that's all that matters. And I think I remember in my first video, I sat there and in my head I was imagining making that video for my future self. And that's the only person I was talking to in that video. I wanted my future self to be able to look back at this time and see how much I'm struggling, but also how much I was willing to look at that struggle and make an effort to come out of it and transmute that energy. And that's still what I'm getting at now. So I'm back on the horse. I'm trying again. I'm making another video. Right now it's just me sitting in front of a camera and talking, but I think that's what I've needed my whole life, is someone to talk to, but in a way where it's not an actual person. I definitely know that there's a lot to gain out of having personal one-on-one relationships with people, and that's where I really thrive in my life, is one-on-one situations. But in this case, it's the whole act of talking to a camera, but that camera is, again, myself, my future self, whether that's in 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 years, it doesn't matter. But the point is, I'm making a choice to face this stuff and do these things because I want to, but also drawing on the fact of letting other people encourage me to do something they know that I would really enjoy. Like, that's the whole sinking into it thing, and being in receiving energy. It's hard. It's really humbling, and I think that's why a lot of people are scared of the topic of shadow work, is because they know it would take looking at a side of themselves that they have been actively avoiding, subconsciously avoiding, for very good reasons, because your shadow self, again, is linked oftentimes to a lot of trauma or just repressed stuff, inheritance from your lineage. Again, a big part of my inheritance is being the tough one, being the hero, being the one that is the go-getter, being the one who's the cheerleader. And I can still be those things, but without sacrificing my own mental health and especially recently my physical health. Having enough discernment to realize when it makes sense to stop being the cheerleader for everybody else and number one, start cheering for myself, and number two, letting other people cheer for me and being okay with receiving that energy. This is heavy stuff. And again, I'm not really necessarily coming to a conclusion here, but just the simple act of talking about it is, I think, putting me on a path that is starting to feel really good. And it's scary. It's scary, but you got to do things scared sometimes. And I think I've liked to paint this image for myself that when I'm pursuing things or just going after life, like I'm doing it in such a fearless way, and if I show fear, that means that I've been too vulnerable, and vulnerability is scary. But vulnerability doesn't make you weak. And for so long, I thought it did. And I've been, I think, surface level vulnerable about the go getter mentality in my life. Like, I've had moments where I admit, man, that was crazy, but I did it. But not actually diving into the fact that that crazy I'm talking about, like, that crazy led me to develop chronic health issues. That crazy led me to being in a 2-3 year long hermit period. There have been a lot of things that have come out of making too hasty of decisions or just downplaying what those decisions have done to me and not having enough discernment in those moments or judgment. I think what we get wrong about judgment is that it's a bad thing to be judgy, but the judgment and Virgo energy comes from a place of spiritually knowing that decision is going to have consequences, because the opposite sign of Virgo is Pisces, and Pisces works with the spirit and the mental. And I think that's why Pisces gets discredited a lot with their own judgment or intuition, is sometimes there's not something in the 3D world to back their discernment. And that's where the Virgo-ness comes in, is sometimes we can point to, like, let's take the chronic illness stuff. Like, when I'm having flare-ups in my body or I'm getting a lot of rashes. Like, I think back to one instance in college where I was seeing someone, and within the first week of being involved with this person, my whole body was breaking out in rashes and acne, which, keep in mind, at that point in my life, I virtually had no acne or skin problems throughout even high school when it's supposed to be the worst. But yet, I gaslit myself in that moment. I'm just like, oh, it's probably the stress of school. Because at that point, I think I was taking 18 to 20 credit, like a lot of credit hours, more than they recommend. But that's because I was trying to squeeze things in before my next semester. But I look back at that moment and I realize how much, again, I was gaslighting myself and not trusting my own intuition. But that's what this Virgo real life evidence has taught me, is it's about listening to your body, but your body is just an extension of your your mind and your soul. And especially as a neurodivergent person, it's hard for us to live in our bodies because living in a world where it's not geared towards neurodivergent people and systems aren't in place for us to thrive, yeah, we're being constantly gaslit about the way that we do things. And we are being taken so far out of our bodies that what's the word for it? We have poor interoception, so that mind and body connection is severed basically in neurodivergent people. And it's a shame because we can be some of the most intuitive, connected people if we are given the space to. And if it weren't for my chronic health issues, I don't think I ever would have stopped and sat and looked at this stuff and realized how out of body a lot of my choices had taken me. And so again, it's become this canary in a coal mine situation that I am incredibly thankful for. And I've actually, by looking around the chronic illness community, watching videos, reading stuff, a lot of people have mentioned, and this is something I resonate with too, is I think my chronic health journey has aligned quite well with my spiritual journey. The chronic illness was something that like propelled me into a spiritual awakening, I feel like, because again, it showed me how far out of my body I was. My soul was over here, my intuition was down there. Nothing was connected, and I'm starting to feel whole within myself and most importantly in my body. And that's where I can really draw upon this whole expectations versus desire, expectations versus personal needs and wants. And because now I'm able to live more in my body and as an extent, with my brain and with my soul, because I've covered that and I know what it feels like to have my own personal desires, I am now able to kind of sink into this expectations territory and just unpacking it and most importantly transmuting it and realizing where it's been infiltrating my ability to just be in tune with my own desires. And I'm super thankful that I've had this opportunity. Yes, it's resulted in me being sick and unable to engage with a lot of things in my life, but as a result, it's kept me from spaces and people that weren't good for me or just weren't willing to understand my circumstances. I think of all the ways that it's infiltrated my social life. And at first, that was the hardest part for me, is like not being able to be as social as I desire. But what it has shown me is that I was pushing myself to be social for the sake of being social, and the sake of having friends to say I have friends. But through this journey, it's really showed me who the real people in my life are, because they don't fault me for pulling back and sitting with myself and going through this journey. They don't shame me for needing to recalibrate a bit, because ultimately that makes me a better friend, is being able to, I think I mentioned this in a past video too, is not being able to pour from an empty cup. And the other saying was, in order to be selfless, you first have to be selfish. Like I said in that video, like I used to chalk the word selfish up to just the worst of the worst. But this chronic health journey has shown me that selfishness is just you looking out for yourself and you standing up for yourself. And yes, in my case, it manifested as the chronic health issues, but if that's what it took in my life for me to sink into my truest of desires, my complete authenticity, then that's what it took. And so I'm going to be grateful for this experience and choose not to look at it as something that's set me back 10 paces. Because that's falling too deep into comparison, and that's not what this is about anymore. I can't even afford to compare myself anymore to people. That just depletes me of so much energy that I need to I need that energy to cook for myself. I need that energy to go on my daily walks. I need that energy to focus on what sort of therapy or treatment I'm going to try next. So the more energy I give away to things that just have nothing to do with my well-being, the worse off I am. So being selfish has really, the definition has changed for me. And I think that also ties into this shadow stuff, is like I used to think being in receiving mode too much was selfish, or it didn't leave enough room for other people to receive their blessings. But my ability to receive and continue to be in receiving mode doesn't have to take away from other people. I can experience that in my life, and somebody else can experience it in their own way. I deserve to take up space and be provided for, celebrated, protected, I guess, if we're talking about that Aries energy. But yeah, I think I'll just kind of leave this here. This was just a stream of consciousness about expectations versus desires. And I think this is an ongoing conversation, but this is the beginning of it. And I'm feeling excited. I haven't felt excited about life in quite a while. So this has given me the permission to just let things flow. And letting things flow can be uncomfortable, but only if you make it.